The title of the book again is Magnificent Militancy, the African American Revolution of 1963, Thomas Jackson's new book. Tom also seeks to answer the question of why revolutionary self-understandings evaporated from public memory and also from historical accounts of the Revolution of 1963. Tom has a long and productive relationship with the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. Previous fellowships made possible his first book, From Civil Rights to Human Rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Struggle for Economic Justice. It argues that King's civil rights ministry understood that poverty and racism are fundamentally problems of power, and this book emphasized the radicalism of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thought and, again, his ministry. From Civil Rights to Human Rights won the Organization of American Historians' prestigious Liberty Legacy Foundation Award in 2007 for the best book on civil rights from the nation's founding to the present. He teaches and mentors students at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He is also an affiliate of the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. He is co-organizing a symposium commemorating the Civil Rights Act of 1964's 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary is on May 2nd, 2014. He will say more about this. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Jackson.
Thank you, Calvin, for that generous introduction. I would like to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the Foundation for this, now my third fellowship here, and of course the Miller Center for ponying up enough to bring me here, and the UNC Greensboro College of Arts and Sciences for also supporting my year off. My work has taken an interesting turn since coming here, very much focused on the question of memory. How is the past remembered and how is it used in the present? In 1963 and in 2013. 2013 was a time of intense commemoration. Next year will be as well. The actual anniversary is July 2nd, but the Miller Center had to schedule for May 2nd, the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And 1963 was a year of intense commemoration, the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Unlike today, they acutely sensed, because of a mass revolt, that they were living in a revolutionary moment. Our sense of history defines our sense of the possible, but so does what's happening out in the country. 700 protests in over 200 cities. Led everybody from Malcolm X to John Kennedy to call what they were experiencing a revolution. Now, at the core of that and today is the issue of how to define progress. How do you overcome a stubbornly unequal status quo based on oppression and racial hierarchy? How do you confront the dangers of falling back, of regression? They're remarkably similar then and now, although the issues are quite different, and how the movement and the media define what civil rights is and what it takes to achieve equality have remarkable similarities from 50 years ago to today, but also some real marked differences that I'll get into. A recurring theme in the commemorations that I've looked at, and they are, here's a schematic of kind of the structure of the revolution itself and of the representations in 2013. Common theme that you see filtered through the commemorations is very American and very individualistic, that individuals have within themselves the capacity to achieve anything they set their hearts to, including inspiration of massive social change. And this ideal is attached to Martin Luther King, but it's also carried by people like John Lewis, who's very much been recently celebrated as a civil rights icon. This is more for me than for you. You can refer to it later. But the revolution itself in '63, on the 100th anniversary, was widespread. in North and South. And those are the cities that saw the most newsworthy, but certainly not the most wrenching transformations and protests. And they culminated at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28th. Today, pretty much that march is seen as a platform for King to give his dream speech. So in many ways, you have multiple reductionism, right? A mass movement is reduced to a mass march. A mass march is reduced to the culminating speech. The culminating speech is reduced to the peroration, which is very much affirmative, okay, of the possibilities and perhaps the eventuality of racial equality. And so anybody speaking to commemoration usually begins with the dream as a kind of an empty vessel, often in which they can pour whatever ideas of, and agendas, political agendas, that they have. At its worst, at its best, it's an opportunity truly to assess how far have we come and what remains. So this is the structure of a lot of the discourse. We've come a long way, and we have a long way to go. Okay? Actually, this King's speech it was a moment of kind of massive affirmation, but also of determination to make democracy real. You'll see John Kennedy administration, if I can get to it, there was a lot of effort to use that march to proclaim to the world that, in fact, we are a well-functioning democracy. If we can assemble in the nation's capital for redress of grievances peacefully, we're unlike all those communist nations. And you'll sort of see some of that. But within the movement itself, there was a counter-pressure, too, to say, well, we're not yet a democracy, and there's a lot yet to be done, including action in the streets, which is what my favorite line from that dream speech is, go back to the South. And also a lot of concrete measures that would bring equality in jobs, schools, housing, voting rights, protection for civil rights workers in the South. None of these things were fully and satisfactorily addressed by John Kennedy's bill, okay? So in many ways, this was a march to support that bill in confrontation with Congress, but also to state and to affirm that bill was not going to be enough, okay? That there was a full agenda. The thing I'd like to begin with here is Jeff Peguet's CBS News.
Clifford Lee was here in 1963.
I was inspired then, I'm still inspired by that speech. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed.
King's I Have a Dream speech inspired a movement, and tens of thousands of people have come from across the nation to honor his vision. Congressman John Lewis says that vision includes everyone.
It doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. It doesn't matter whether we're straight or gay, we're one people.
Many came on buses, leaving home in the early morning hours to retrace the steps of this historic march.
We're here to pay homage to that moment in time, but to also carry that forward.
Edith Lee Payne walked as a 12-year-old. Here she is that August day, barely tall enough to see through the crowds.
I'm honored to be here standing for those that were here 50 years ago and aren't here today.
But this is not just a commemoration, it's a call to action. Martin Luther King III told the crowd he believes his father's dream has not yet been realized.
Far too frequently, the color of one's skin remains a license to profile, to arrest, and to even murder with no regard for the content of one's character.
Half a century later, while many here are celebrating progress, 81-year-old Clifford Lee says the march continues.
We haven't come far enough. We still got a long ways to go.
Okay, just mention a few things about this. I'm always feeling like I'm analyzing half-truths and trying to fill in the picture. Martin Luther King did not inspire the movement. as much as he himself was inspired by it. The revolution and the movement made the March on Washington and made King's dream speech possible. So to say that King inspired is very much in a mode of framing that puts him as the initiator and the inspiration. That's one item. Another item is our modern tendency that wasn't there in '63 to counterpoise icons and famous people with ordinary people's experience. Okay, that's a more contemporary interest. But the degree to which the dream is relevant in Martin Luther King III's view very much has to do with today's issues of vigilantism sanctioned by Stand Your Ground laws, the Trayvon Martin case, the Stand Your Ground laws, and by the stop and frisk policies of the New York City Police Department. That's kind of what he's referring to there. A second major theme in most of the speeches at these two commemorations, 24th and the 28th of August, was the recent Supreme Court striking down of the key provision of the Voting Rights Act. So voter suppression in Texas and North Carolina pretty much preoccupied a lot of the discussion of, why does the dream matter today? Okay. Now, there's a lot more, and other people spoke to other aspects of the legacy and what that march was about and what we don't know about that march. But just to reinforce, another major news outlet really exemplifies a way in which I think what I call the moderation of militancy. To understand King not as a radical dissenter from American practices, but as a pragmatic idealist. And Jon Meacham, in the Founding Father issue, commemorative issue of Time, says it really well. He wouldn't be surprised by the ambivalent state of affairs of America. We've come a long way, we've got a long way to go. Like our more familiar founders, Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, he's a practical idealist, a man who could articulate an ideal, but knew that human progress, while sometimes intoxicatingly rapid, tends to be a provisional enterprise. King is a moderate, okay? Not a social revolutionary, our founders weren't, right? But as a moderate. In many ways, these frames have their origin at the time, the day after the March on Washington, which in many ways was a radical expression of expectation for a whole range of social changes. Scotty Reston, James Reston, puts King at, he really did steal the show. I mean, there's truth to this, okay? And he was the most popular black leader at the time. But James Reston frames King as a moderate leader in the tradition of the founders at the time, and puts the I Have a Dream speech front and center. So that, for example, the organizers of the speech, or the organizers of the march, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, socialists who really wanted to foreground the need for jobs as well as freedom, already are getting kind of pushed to the background. The icon is already moving to the fore. The United States Information Agency gets in on the game, right? And immediately they bring all the celebrities who came to the March on Washington together to discuss the significance of the dream, okay? And I think you can see in this clip an enduring debate about how far have we come, what's it going to take to really achieve equality, right? And how much do we have America to thank for our freedoms? So I'll let you listen to this as well. This is Civil Rights Roundtable, moderated by CBS correspondent Schoenbrunn, Charles Schoenbrunn, and he's a protege of Edward R. Murrow, who is then running the U.S. Information Agency. This film was not shown within the United States. The segregationists in Congress wouldn't let that happen. But here's a discussion between Charlton Heston and Harry Belafonte, two of the celebrities.
This is not really a flag-waving question of mine, but I've been a foreign correspondent for a quarter of a century. All of you gentlemen have worked overseas. It does occur to me that demonstrations of this kind could not easily be held elsewhere, And when we talk about oppression and repression, I haven't seen any march on Moscow or march on Peking. And with all the faults that we have and which we're trying to examine, wouldn't you agree it's fair that the hope of our country is that we can have demonstrations of this kind?
Well, prime thing I extracted from today's events was a quite hopeful and stirring feeling of for the future, and also a restatement of the principles on which this country was founded. Dr. King said most eloquently that now seems finally to be the time when the check which the Negro American has presented so often and had returned to him marked insufficient funds may at last be on the verge of being cashable, and in terms of equality with his fellow Americans. But as an American, I am as stirred by the fact that this is true as I am by whatever capacity I have to empathize with my Negro fellow citizens in their eloquent cry that it finally happened now.
Will this tremendous outburst now lead to a course of action, Mr. Belafonte, that
I
will
feel
speed
that
up?
The now that we speak of is not a now that describes a success or fulfillment of the issues and the grievances that face the Negro people. The now is a statement that from here on in there's a point of no return. That there is success or there is utter failure. There is no middle of the line. There is no compromise on the issue. The now that is being spoken about is the fact that in 100 years, finally, through whatever the causes have been in history, and most of them have been because of oppression, the Negro people have strongly and fully taken the bit in their teeth. They're asking absolutely no quarter from anyone. And that, and I don't mean to say that the black community is not a community that does not have responsibility in this current revolution. But I do say that the bulk of the interpretation of whether this thing is going to end successfully and joyously or is going to end disastrously lays very heavily with the white community. It lays very heavily with the profiteers. It lays very heavily with the vested interests. It lays very heavily with a great middle stream in this country of people who have refused to commit themselves or even have the slightest knowledge that these things have been going on. And those who have decried demonstrations and who have said the Negro is going too far, they are the ones who in fact are being provoked the most by this, because for the first time, and it is only throughout demonstrations, that they have come to a level of consciousness. And in this now that we speak of, it is this point of no return, because we are on the march and there is going to be no return from it, because the march in Washington today is one thing, but it doesn't.
One thing he does say, I'm not going to play the whole thing at the end, is that I refuse to measure, to take a yardstick of democracy and change from some decayed society that refuses to grant freedom to its own, so that the fact that we can hold this march and they can't in Peking is irrelevant, because we proclaim democracy, you know, as the defender of the free world. And he also speaks about the Kennedy administration's recent claim that its efforts had really resulted in appreciable and recognizable social change. And he said, that just reminds me of that. I mean, compared to what needs to happen, the Kennedy administration has not, he says. So this is kind of the back and forth where Charlton Heston, there's a funny story about Charlton Heston coming, if you want to ask me in the... But that debate about American democracy and its potential and about the true sources of social change was happening in many arenas, including the USIA. Few appreciated at the time. King's speech was not his most radical, but how much he really was a social gospel minister and remained faithful to some of those central tenets that were quite critical of the income inequality resulting from capitalism and the tendency of nationalism to translate into militarism. You find him speaking at the retail and department store workers on October 29th, 20,000 people, Madison Square Garden, okay? in an idiom that is not something that most Americans are familiar with today and that you can't really find anywhere on the internet.
The Unrest Warehouse Union, District 60.
Millions of people are jobless, even while business leaders are complacently and contentedly pronouncing the economy as surging and robust. Our nation may be able to put a man on the moon in a few years, but it still cannot find out how to put a Negro in the legislature of Mississippi or put an unemployed worker back on a job. I have nothing against exploration of the moon or the planets, but if we can reach so high that we can challenge the mysteries and dangers of space, surely we can challenge the poverty and discrimination under our feet. Just a few days ago in Birmingham, Alabama, the local newspaper said, "When are Negroes going to end these demonstrations and allow things to return to normalcy?" Well, I must say to Birmingham and to others that we all believe in and work for a legitimate, healthy, positive normalcy, but that is a normalcy that we will never work to preserve, for we will never forget that it was normalcy in Mississippi that made for the vicious murder of Medgar Evers. It is normalcy in the villages and hamlets and cities of Georgia that prevents Negroes from staying in motels and hotels. It is normalcy in the nation that so often takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. It is normalcy in the world that makes for the madness of militarism and the poisoning of the atmosphere with nuclear tests. No, we will not return to that kind of normalcy. Never will we return to it.
One of my favorite dream speeches is probably also not familiar to you or most Americans. It's 2 years later, on July 4th, 1965, when he really says, "I've seen in these 2 years my dream turn into a nightmare because of the relentless violence against civil rights workers in the South, but also because of all the poverty and joblessness that continued to plague the nation." He does echo John Lewis in that initial speech. He said, "I have a vision of a nation like Jamaica," he'd just come back from Jamaica, "where everybody can be their nationality and Jamaican, right? Of multiculturalism, where it doesn't matter if you are black or white, Protestant or Catholic, right, descendant of British or Africans. And yet, at the same time, tied to that vision of multiculturalism is a conception of economic justice. And the importance of raising wages. What makes work menial, he said, is not the work, it's the wages. So I recommend that highly to you as a statement of his conviction. John Lewis, his speech at the March on Washington was the second most rousing. Actually, I've listened to all 6 hours. You can only do that in New York City at the Paley Center for Media. I've listened to all 6 hours of CBS coverage. King got the loudest cheers and most sustained. Mahalia Jackson and John Lewis competed for second place, right? And so as a congressman today, John Lewis is very much a carrier of civil rights memory and a potential connection to that moment and to the relevant history that that moment might supply. And his comments on the state of America are quite trenchant, but I would come back to this theme of half-truths, okay? In interview after interview after interview, and in his speeches to both commemorative marches, Representative Lewis sounds more like a legislator than an activist. This is the most radical thing I've heard John Lewis, and it's on Fox News, say, and it's a brief clip.
Let's talk about that. Democratic Congressman John Lewis of Georgia was a close friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He stood with Reverend King, in fact, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial 50 years ago during that historic march on Washington. Lewis, a college student then, was one of the speakers. He says King's speech and the march changed history. Some reflections now from Congressman Lewis.
We have made some progress. We've come a distance, but we still have a distance to go. We still have roads to travel. It was a march for jobs and freedom. There's hundreds and thousands and millions of our brothers and sisters without jobs 50 years later.
250,000 people participated in the March on Washington on August 28th.
Okay. He mentions mass incarceration at the end of his major speech on August 28th, before Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and Barack Obama. He mentions mass unemployment, okay, as an unmet challenge. And yet that comes in the last 15 seconds or so of a 10-minute speech, which I'm not going to play it all for you because I actually played a lot with excerpting it with my video software over the weekend and came up with a rather long, but I can certainly let you see it. What he talks about is the degree of amazing change that he has seen just beginning.
Sometimes I hear people saying nothing has changed. But for someone to grow up the way I grew up in the cotton fields of Alabama, to now be serving in the United States Congress, makes me want to tell them, come and walk in my shoes. Come, walk in the shoes of those who were attacked by police dogs, fire hoses, and nightsticks, arrested and taken to jail. I first came to Washington in the same year that President Barack Obama was born to participate in the Freedom Ride. In 1961, black and white people could not be seated together on a Greyhound bus. So
I won't let this slow down the presentation, but what he says is there's a series of remarkable successes that he was part of, okay? The integration of transportation, the Voting Rights Act that, you know, he got his head busted in service of in '65. The importance of the March on Washington, okay, to bringing to national attention, but also, you know, to the attention. The meeting with John Kennedy, where Kennedy says to all of them, you did a good job, you did a good job, you did a good job, but then turns to King and said, but you had a dream. And he credits King with teaching him and everybody else nonviolence, which is true, but John Lewis studied nonviolence with Kelly Miller Smith and James Lawson in Nashville, and probably his most important teachers were his fellow comrades in SNCC. So he's centering King, and he is holding this up as a moment of triumph and success and celebrating that, and then in the last 15 seconds addressing the unmet challenges. So you know, part of me in my arrogance wants to, and I will be interviewing him, to say, John Lewis, meet John Lewis. Because there's a number of things that he's not telling us about that moment and his participation, okay? In Mississippi, in South Georgia, in Cambridge, Maryland, in Danville, Virginia, the revolution, the masses are on the march making this revolution. It stirred the crowd, okay? The little cultural things mattered, okay? But to put Taylor Branch in the middle of that, I think, is an interesting interposition. It's a wonderful film, but it really doesn't fully capture just what this march was wanting to achieve. Okay, it's a lot of individual stories of the people who were there and who made it. What he doesn't tell you about what he said in that speech, you can't really learn it from the New York Times the day after, because they focus on the speech he didn't give, the one that he deleted passages from. And this passage, we will march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did, pursue our scorched earth policy, and burn Jim Crow to the ground nonviolently. That's what the Times went, and he took that out, okay? And of all the leaders' speeches, John Lewis was not excerpted. He got a special story about what he didn't actually say, what was too radical for the rest of, okay. Roger Mudd called it an incitement to riot. In the audio tapes of the Kennedy White House, that's when Jack Kennedy concluded that SNCC was quote-unquote violent and a quote-unquote bunch of bastards, okay, from this language. So that's not necessarily true that he welcomed John Lewis as a proud father at the time. There are missing pieces. One of them is supplied by AFL-CIO Secretary-Treasury Arlene Holt Baker on the August 24th, which was a much more radical commemoration that Martin Luther King III and Al Sharpton and the National Action Network kind of put together. Had a lot of labor people who understandably remembered aspects of that agenda that a lot of other media outlets and actors did not. So here's her memory of the John Lewis speech.
50 years ago, a 23-year-old man by the name of John Lewis asked a question. He asked, where is the equality for the maid who earned $5 a week in the home of a family whose income was $100,000 a year? Where is the equality for those of us who work in the southern fields from sunup to sundown for $12 a week? We're asking that same question today, when the minimum wage is actually lower than it was half a century ago. 50 years ago, A. Philip Randolph stood with Brother Lewis and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and 250,000 men and women from across America to demand jobs and freedom. Unemployment then among African Americans was 10%. It's about 13% today. Our demands today are the same as they were 50 years ago. We need jobs for...
And we need our freedom now. This is a feature of the way the video cuts off. Okay, so that's an important piece. And that's the only reference I heard to this part of his speech. This is a photograph I took of the TV monitor in New York City, okay, when I was watching the speech, and this is my transcript. We need a bill. Okay, not where is that. We need a bill that will provide the homeless and starving people of this nation. We need a bill that will ensure the equality of a maid who earns $5 a week in the home of a family whose total income is $100,000 a year. We must have a good FEPC bill, Fair Employment Practices Commission. It was not in the Kennedy bill, okay. Nor did they see much relief for the unemployed. There were some initial plans to extend youth employment training, but to a person, the March leadership, they were in an interesting condition because they were confronting Congress. Don't filibuster this Kennedy bill, okay? It's going to end public accommodation, segregation in the past. But Kennedy, this isn't enough. We can get more. You are being too cautious, okay? And this was not just John Lewis, it was everybody. It was poorly covered at the time, and it's little known now that in fact there was not this sort of proud father moment when John Kennedy welcomed them all and had a harmonious. There was some contention there after the march, and there was some attempt by the Kennedys to kind of suppress these demands. He said, unless Title III is put in this bill, there's nothing to protect the young children and old women who must face police dogs and firehouses in the South. Now, this is a story that I could go into in some considerable depth, and it centers on the county of LaFleur and the city of Greenwood in Mississippi, where civil rights workers were being beaten and incarcerated by the police. The Justice Department had brought an injunction to stop the police from doing this, right? But then mysteriously they had dropped that legal suit. And since the 50s, the mainstream civil rights leadership was saying, we need the Attorney General to have authority to bring litigation against anybody in the South depriving Americans of their civil rights. Okay? Title III. They didn't get that in 57. Lyndon Johnson bargained that away. Okay? They didn't get it in 1960. That was a voting rights provision. They still wanted that. Because, you know, if you can't march down the street, it doesn't matter if you're testing a desegregated theater. If you can't march down the street, it doesn't matter if you can get to the courthouse. So that, you know, that is a crucial element of everybody's demands here. And there, Kennedy, you can listen to the Miller Center's JFK Oval Office audio tapes and hear Kennedy and Burke Marshall and Robert Kennedy say, we don't want to touch Title III with a 10-foot pole. It's just too toxic. It's going to get too much trouble with our southern base of the Democratic Party. And that maybe what will take this movement out of the streets back into the courts will be a public accommodations law that opens up the public spaces of the South. Okay? So fair employment, full employment, they're on the agenda, but they're not recognized necessarily in the media or really fully understood then, I think, or now. And it's not just the media's fault. I think that the message at the time was overwhelmingly, will this become a violent riot? And after it's over, what a relief that it was so orderly and peaceful. That kind of dominates a lot of public official statements and a lot of the media coverage. But the march had goals, okay? And the first one is pass that darn public accommodations bill, Title II. Well, move down, increase the minimum wage to $2 an hour from $1.15. And, oh, by the way, back in the 30s, the Southern Bloc managed to get agricultural workers and domestic workers exempted from minimum wage, Social Security, okay, and collective bargaining protections, and we need at least a minimum wage for excluded categories of workers that are, you know, farm workers and domestics, okay? But that's kind of buried down here on page 19, okay, with I Have a Dream on the front page. So, you know, it's hard to get these policy issues across, right? A great opportunity is actually to listen to the 5 hours, as I'm sure many Americans did. Of all the speeches, they all talk about this. We need Title III, we need FEPC, we need public works programs for the 5 to 7 million unemployed. The coverage is interesting. Roger Mudd narrates through the whole thing. He does a very adequate job, but he makes this crucial error in saying the whole purpose of this march is to demonstrate support for Kennedy's civil rights bill, now pending in front of Congress. He realizes by the end of the broadcast that there are all these other demands, but he says, well, you know, each of them is really unlikely to pass Congress. Okay. So this idea that they all came to Washington to pass the bill has reverberated through, and you find even capable historians now who are repeating this because it's been repeated so much, right? This is from the commemorative volume put together by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and photographer Bob Edelman, a really important movement photographer. This is the same thing. The purpose of the demonstration is to demand that Congress pass pending legislation outlawing state-supported segregation in public places throughout the land. I Have a Dream, the 50th year testament to the march that changed America. $45, Amazon.com. Beautiful photographs. Look at the pictures, and you'll see immediately it's not just about public accommodations. These are hand-printed signs, but they're also formally printed. Freedom Now, Dignity for Domestic Workers, National Domestic Workers Association. Civil rights plus full employment equals freedom. We march for higher minimum wages coverage, okay? No dough to help Jim Crow. That's Title VI to try to get the federal government to deny hospitals and school districts federal funding if they're discriminating, okay? Voting rights, jobs for all, okay? The photo record, these are all Bob Edelman shots. The photo record is rich. The film record is rich in this kind of jobs and freedom agenda, and yet these frames kind of get placed and stubbornly remain in place. I have some quotes from the meeting itself. Thanks to the Miller Center for putting all of these audio tapes online from the John F. Kennedy Library. You can listen to what they actually talked about. I don't hear John Kennedy saying you did a good job and I have a dream, but maybe that's when he met them. What I hear is a lot more about full and fair employment, affordable housing, and Title III. We need some legal pressure against these Southern sheriffs in the South. And I'm going to wrap this up at this moment. Just with, I excerpted some of these things. You can hear A. Philip Randolph.
Emphasis needs to be placed on the inclusion of the Fair Employment Practice Bill in the package that you presented to the Congress.
This matter of fair employment we know must also be linked with full employment. There seems to be something ought to be done to help them get jobs now. We need massive public works ought to be developed. Unless that isn't done, they're all going to go on relief anyway, he says. Other people echo this, including the so-called moderate NAACP Executive Director Roy Wilkins, who says, these people don't just want desegregation and public accommodations, they want something that will affect their daily lives. And he goes on to say, it's not just civil rights leaders. There are 250,000 people who went out of their way to come make these claims, and part of them is an FEPC bill, okay? And he's saying, we can get this out of the Judiciary Committee if you join us, okay? And Walter Reuther, the UAW president, chimes in on the same thing. But here's John Kennedy's response, and I think it kind of speaks volumes about how this proud father analogy is a bit of a, maybe I think it's kind of an annoyed father that you actually hear on the tapes.
It's possible for the Negro community, particularly to place a major emphasis upon the responsibility of these families, even if they're split and all the rest of the problems they have, on educating their children. Now, in my opinion, the Jewish community, which suffered a good deal of the discrimination, or the great effort they made, which I think has made them a little influential, was an education of their children, and therefore they've been able to establish a strong position for themselves. This has nothing to do with what you've been talking about. What seems to me, with all the influence which all you gentlemen have in the Negro community, if we could emphasize that there's nothing these adults can do about the education they've lost.
They have to concentrate. Look at the Jewish community, and you ministers need to get out there and preach self-help and the value of education, okay? That's his response to the policy arguments. They get very angry. Whitney M. Young, it's not in the book, that's a transcript because it's kind of all barely audible, but I recognize his voice, and he's saying, Mr. President, if 13% of the total population were unemployed like the Negro, you'd have a shooting revolution, okay? And he makes the case for his Marshall Plan for the Negro at the same time. So while this is the most important piece of civil rights legislation since the Act of 1875, it is not meeting the expectations and aspirations of this upswelling grassroots movement that these leaders are trying to stay kind of out in front of, okay, for jobs as well as freedom. I'm not going to go into this because I want to leave time for questions, but there are a number of instances I have from the John F. Kennedy Library where they're actually jumping in there to try to shape the message and the spin. John Riley, the Justice Department, was responsible for the security of the sound system. How could it be taken over, and can we cut it off? And he's making notes to himself about the only program they appeared on television, the Big Six leadership that night, in D.C., moderated by J.R. Kennedy. Kennedy should be briefed on how JFK and Pierre Salinger, press secretary, would like the show to go, line of questioning it should take. And sure enough, in the transcript of J. Kennedy, he's saying, now, Mr. Lewis, what do you feel you offer to white youth? Okay? Which is a little bit of a deflection from what. Or when he says, what's the achievement of this? Well, King says, there are individuals who constantly talk about violence and the possibility of a riot. Of course, I find those individuals who do this are really consciously or unconsciously creating the atmosphere for violence. And Kennedy says, well, the point is that there was no violence there today. There was none, not a bit of it, not a shred of it. And he just kind of talks over. Half of the whole program is J.R. Kennedy. Who's J.R. Kennedy? Talking about what a moderate achievement for nonviolence this was. J.R. Kennedy, Harry Belafonte informed King 3 days later, Harry Belafonte had fired him in 1958 because he discovered he was working for the FBI. And his real name is Samuel Richard Solomonic, later the lover of Elaine Brown of the Black Panthers. So there's more. One of them has to do with why is the whole Black Revolution reduced to Birmingham? And I have some evidence from the time from Ralph McGill basically saying everything was going fine here in Atlanta until Birmingham lit all these sparks of revolution, right? So the idea that somehow television caused televised, that's in the scholarship today, and it's right back there in the media. But I need to stop and take some questions from you all. Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, so much for sharing this with us. What I wanted to ask was just a little bit of kind of a framing question so that we can kind of get an understanding of the whole project, because I know it's a project that's in process. But is your project then to address that, okay, today we see the civil rights movement, or the dominant mainstream way in which the movement is portrayed, and you're going back and saying, okay, there are these other views of seeing it? And if so, then how do you address the problem that you just sort of introduced, which is even back then, of course, there are all these multiple lenses with which we could interpret what's occurring. So I was just wondering, how you address that. It's almost an analytical strategy, right, of the multiple interpretations that are occurring then as well as now, and how do you filter through all that? And then what do you think that you're going to want to say yourself through your own interpretive lens? So.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, this has a question of how I'm structuring the book, and pulling in the reader through these commemorations I think is a good idea, but I've shared a lot with you in actually the last chapter of historical memory, right? And the middle chapters really are about the revolution and the internal debates among media actors, public officials, and different actors in the movement. James Baldwin is a fascinating voice in this, and he's saying directly to Robert Kennedy, no, you haven't made progress. We haven't seen progress in 100 years. The Civil Rights Commission hires John Hope Franklin to write a book called Freedom for the Free to commemorate. And they don't like what he comes up with. It's too negative. So they fire him and they hire some other people to write something that reflects well on progress. So these themes of progress and of, the multiple perspectives, they're going to operate in the present on kind of either ends of the book, but pulling the reader into those debates then about memory, and to try to build on, let's see, some of the work that's been done that restores the labor movement to this march. Will Jones's wonderful book on Randolph and the dream of the march, he does a very good job of that. What he doesn't necessarily address is why at the time this whole idea, what is civil rights, was contested. Many of the other actors in the coalition, the church people especially, thought, I didn't think civil rights meant minimum wage. Why are you telling me I need to support the minimum? So there were negotiations within that coalition that seemed to be very interesting. And so it's a way of getting back there and saying there are multiple meanings of civil rights. They're contested meanings that you can't just say the movement joined with Kennedy and they got a civil rights bill, and that in many ways what Kennedy deferred just stayed on, they had to come back to it later in the decade in different contexts. So I don't know how much that answers your question, but you are identifying an added layer. I didn't quite expect to have so much on modern memory, but it is so interesting today what different actors have made of that moment, that this question of memory And it was sort of happening then. How much progress have we really made? What remains unfulfilled? It was the same question. How it's answered today is a bit different, but those core issues of mass unemployment, police violence, unaffordable housing, they are very much the same. Arlene Holt is right. Hey.
Thank you for your presentation. I don't know whether it was planned or not, but it's interesting that today is a memorial for Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
And that many of the issues that you've discussed involve a separation between what you might call legal constitutional rights and those that are more economic and based on economic activity. And that appraisal will be taking place, of course, in South Africa now. But my main point is this. It is often said that those who control the present control the past. It appears from your presentation that it isn't so much a question of control, although it does appear that the emphasis on the present and the issues of the present color their memory of the past. Do you find that generally true? Is the issue of public memory one of potential manipulation and distortion rather than a passive recollection of someone other than professional historians?
It's still contested, and this I'm finding is so interesting. I saw on Fox News the other night Charles Krathhammer and what's his name, George Will, paying tribute to Mandela for bringing a post-racial society to South Africa and saying, oh, by the way, that's what King did nonviolently, right? And we have both of them, those heroes to celebrate, and of course not mentioning the issues of racism and poverty that still persist, and that's a powerful medium. But at this march, you also find people like Janet Moralgia of the La Raza saying, well, there was this relationship between King and the farm workers that we're forgetting, and it was not a simple relationship, but she's sort of recovering that piece of the past, right, and marshaling it. I have a fair number of examples from those C-SPAN. I found them on C-SPAN. That's why I was able to excerpt a lot of this stuff. But the labor people, Mary Kay from the, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it now, but from SEIU, two SEIU service employees people were saying minimum wages were a huge issue then. We need to go out and support the fast food workers if we're going to take King's dream seriously at all. The whole program begins with a guy from Fellowship of Reconciliation quoting King on militarism and holding Obama's foreign policy up to a standard of, that he felt King would be critical of. So the past, I mean, James Baldwin said it in '63, the past is something to be used. The past is a weapon. Okay? Yeah. And it's very much the case. Listen to Cory Booker's. It's an excellent synthesis of what the Moses generation accomplished and what remains to the Joshua generation. He mentions toxic waste. The hip-hop generation, whose spokesman spoke there, said the main civil rights issue, this Black Power dude, is climate change. Okay? That wasn't even on the horizon back then, but it is a way of taking the ideals and concerns and making them meaningful, relevant. My problem is it's all filtered through King's dream, which seems to be a kind of a leaky vessel for everything. And one young woman said it really beautifully in the middle of this, and I wish I had something. She said, I'm tired of all my friends saying, where's Rosa Parks? Where's Martin Luther King? Where's Huey Newton? She said, I tell them, it's just us. So there are some dangers in making kind of heroes out of these people, pulling them out of the context of the movement that produced them, made them famous, but they wouldn't have been famous without.
Do you have a theory of why the coverage was presented the way it was? I mean, we have comedy shows on late night where this is the comedy act. The host, Stephen Colbert, bludgeons the guest with the dominant narrative and ignores what they have to say, simply reinforcing what he wants them to say. And it seemed like the Schoenbrunn interview, if I got his name right, was kind of like that. Okay, now, Mr. Belafonte, tell me, is America great or really great? Because we have this discussion. Over to you. And don't talk about anything about social inequality or racism, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of media studies that goes into this, who controls the means of information production and reproduction. How much is this a corporate thing? I think it has to do with the structure of the news. Certain venues in television actually are wide open for debate if you listen. The 6 hours of the March on Washington is a great example. Broadcast live, largely unmediated by CBS News and a number of other news organizations. And yet the interpreters often put a very moderate spin. I wish Aniko Bodorkozy was here. She does this nicely for television. They go out looking for certain stories that confirm their sense of who they are and how they would act in that situation. So many reporters go out looking for the Southern white moderate, and they'll generally eventually find one, right? Or they focus on black and white together at the March on Washington, as she argues. I actually think that was much more a reflection. That was really there. The salt and pepper. Joan Baez talks about this, how exhilarating it was to play in front of salt and pepper audiences, right? So that's going to be an argument between the communications studies, Aniko Bodorkozy, and kind of me. But I don't have a theory yet. I have a kit bag of frames that I've developed about how violence and the concerns over violence dominate. The theoretical intervention I'm making in communication studies is very much anticipated by a guy named Robert Entman, who said the imprint of the frame in the news media is really the imprint of power. What he means by that is that it's not this self-contained institution. They are very much influenced by the powerful people they interview, right? And you do see a tendency to get news from police, to feature public officials and as the most newsworthy, right? And to relegate somebody in the march as an extremist and to counterpose them with the extremists in the Klan, right? So SNCC gets counterposed with the Klan. These are kind of habits of mind, right? I don't know where quite they come from. I don't think it's a capitalist conspiracy, but I do think it's a frame under which middle-class white news reporters are ordering and making sense out of something that they really are trying to understand, coming to understand. But yeah. The documentaries are fantastic, though. There are some verite documentaries that actually go to Greenwood, streets of Greenwood. The only way I could get it was from some university in the Midwest, and they played a reel-to-reel for me here in Alderman. Nobody else can see it, but it reflects this is a poor people's movement. The students are in the front of it, and the police are not to be trusted. So, yeah, reel-to-reel documentary. Thank you.